They called her Moses, but only God knew how many rivers she'd crossed before freedom. Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In tonight's Figures story, we walk the shadowed paths of a woman who carried 70 souls from bondage to freedom, without a map, without weapons, but with something far more powerful. In tonight's telling, we explore not just what she did, but what it cost her, and how faith turned fear into a road beneath her feet. And I must warn you, what you're about to hear will force you to ask yourself, what would I have done if the cost of saving others meant I might never see the sun again? It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there, no matter how many blankets you piled on. Minty frost crusted over the Delaware marsh, and the moon was so sharp it seemed to cut the darkness in half. Somewhere in those shadows, a young woman named Araminta Ross was already running. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. Her skirts were muddied from swamp water. And somewhere deep in her mind, the words kept returning. Trust him, Minty. Step where he tells you to step. She had not been Harriet Tubman yet, not the Moses of her people, not the feared and revered guide of the Underground Railroad. She was just Minty, the daughter of enslaved parents on a Maryland plantation, carrying more scars than years. One of those scars lay deep in her skull, a dent from a teenage incident when an overseer's iron weight had struck her, not even meant for her. The injury had left her with blinding headaches, sudden blackouts, and visions she couldn't explain. Visions she came to believe were messages from God. That night, one of those visions had stirred in her chest like a drumbeat. Now. Leave now. She knew the risk. For an enslaved woman, escape wasn't just dangerous. It was a declaration of war against an entire system. Capture meant a beating that could kill you. If you survived, you'd be sold farther south, away from everyone you loved, into the deepest hells of the cotton fields. And yet, staying was worse. Her feet slipped over frozen roots. Every shadow looked like a man. She'd memorized the whispered instructions of the few who'd escaped before her. Follow the North Star. Avoid main roads. Trust only those the Lord sends you. Hours later, she reached the first safe house, a small farmhouse with a lantern glowing low in the window. A code. She tapped on the back door 3 times. The white-haired woman inside opened the door, looked her over, and said nothing. She simply motioned for Minty to step inside. The heat from the fire was almost unbearable after the cold. Her fingers tingled painfully as they thawed. The woman handed her a bowl of stew, still without speaking. It was the first silent kindness Minty had known in years. But as she ate, the vision came again, clear as daylight in her mind. You will go back. Again and again. She froze mid-bite. Go back? That was madness. She hadn't even crossed the Pennsylvania border yet. She didn't have a new name or papers or safety. Why would God ask her to risk it all for others, when she'd barely saved herself? 2 nights later, she crossed into Pennsylvania. The moment her feet touched free soil, she would later say, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun shone like gold through the trees, and I felt like I was in heaven. And yet, even in that golden moment, the vision pressed into her soul like a command she couldn't shake. Go back. Most people, if they'd been through what Minty had, would have thanked God and stayed put. But Minty was not most people. She was already wrestling with the question that would define her life. If God had saved her, wasn't it for more than her own freedom? The safe bed felt wrong that night. The stew tasted bitter. And the next morning, she woke with the decision already made in her heart. She would go back. She didn't know it yet, but that choice would place her on a collision course with slave catchers, armed patrols, freezing rivers, and traitors in her own ranks. She would become a name whispered in the dark, sometimes in hope, sometimes in fear. And every time she left the safety of the North, she would carry the same question with her. Would she return alive? But on that first night as a free woman, Harriet Tubman lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if her visions were truly from God, or if she was about to walk herself back into a grave. And then came the sound, the faintest knock on the door. Someone was looking for her, someone who knew her name. I first heard her describe that knock years later in Auburn, by the little stove that never seemed to go out. Her fingers, rough as bark from a lifetime of work, tapped the table as she spoke. Softly. I was free, she said, and the Lord came knocking again. She opened the door. A narrow-faced man with a wool cap stood on the threshold, eyes darting to the street. "You Minty Ross?" he whispered. For a heartbeat, she nearly said yes. In her bones, she was still Minty, the name her mother called across the fields. But in the years just before she ran, after marriage, she had taken her mother's name and her husband's, Harriet Tubman. A sign to herself that God was making something new out of what life had broken. "My name is Harriet," she said, steady now. "Harriet Tubman." The man nodded quickly. "Then you need a friend. Philadelphia's no place to stand long. Come with me." He led her by alleys and lamplight to a row house, where a woman pressed a cup of scalding tea into her hands. The steam felt like mercy. Another knock, another man. A quiet exchange. Names she didn't know yet. Vigilance Committee, Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And one she would never forget. William Still. They brought her to his office by the river where papers were stacked like a second city. Still was gentle-eyed and precise. A man who wrote as if writing could save lives, and sometimes it did. He asked polite questions, then harder ones. Her family names, plantation, overseers, roots. The blow to her head when she was a girl. The visions. When she told him about the visions, how a stillness would fall over her and the path would clear in her mind, he didn't flinch. He just wrote. "If the Lord speaks, we would be fools not to listen," he murmured. She found work, odd jobs in kitchens and hotels. Each coin she saved felt like a stone in a wall she was building across the river her people still had to cross. Nights, she sat by a window and watched the North Star, talking to God in a whisper. "You brought me here," she said, "but you didn't bring me here to leave them there. Show me how." Some people thought freedom would swallow her into its warm belly and keep her there. Pause. But freedom without your people is a room with the door open to a dark hallway. You can't sleep in it. Weeks turned, then months. Word of her reached cousins and friends who'd slipped north. Harriet made it. Word reached south, too. Things like that always do. She learned to be smoke. Present, but always moving. To some, she was the woman who bowed her head and muttered prayer over boiled potatoes. To others, she was a rumor. A small woman with a steady gaze who kept asking the same dangerous question. How do I go back? One evening, Still brought a newspaper folded to a small notice about a scheduled auction in Baltimore. The name on the line was Keziah, her niece. Kizinchi, bright-eyed Kiz, who used to tie corn-husk dolls to her skirts and march them around like they were soldiers. She's to be sold away, Still said, voice low. Her children, too. The room tilted. The vision surged like a tide. Now, but you've barely settled, Harriet, a friend warned. You don't know the roads. You don't have papers. If I'm caught, Harriet said, then I die on the road God told me to walk. He's got to answer for that, not me. A beat. Then, softer. I can't sit here while they sell my blood. She hadn't even fully learned the city street names. Yet she was sketching a different map in her mind. Back routes to Baltimore. The timing of ferries. Who could be trusted, who couldn't. Still introduced her to men who knew docks and secret compartments, and how to make a crowd look left while you moved right. She memorized their faces and promptly forgot their names. One less thing to confess if things went wrong. But there was a new storm coming that none of them controlled. In taverns and parlors up north, men were arguing loudly about a bill in Washington, a bill that would soon become the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. If it passed, even free states would be hunting grounds. Officers could seize an alleged runaway and drag them south without jury or mercy. And anyone who helped, anyone like the woman with the tea, the men in the wool caps, William, still with his careful pen, could be fined or imprisoned. Then, We move faster, Harriet said simply, before the dogs are let loose. How do you prepare to steal a woman and her 2 small children from the mouth of an auction? You don't. You pray, and then you plan like prayer's oxygen. Harriet studied the auctioneer's habits. The back alley behind the market, the way people crowded when money changed hands. A friend found a sailor's jacket that could hide a child. Another found a boat captain who didn't ask questions as long as no one brought trouble aboard. The night before she left, Harriet returned to the same row house, where she'd first warmed her hands. The white-haired woman didn't ask a single question. She just tied a kerchief around Harriet's hair and pressed bread and dried apples into her satchel. "What if you don't come back?" the woman asked finally. Harriet smiled, a small private thing. "Then I'll be where I've always wanted to be," she said. "But if I do come back, I won't be alone." She set out before dawn, moving like a shadow between shadows. The city woke behind her. Wheels on cobblestone, vendors calling, church bells testing the morning. Somewhere on the wind, a hymn drifted up from a kitchen window. "Swing low, sweet chariot." She hummed it under her breath and kept walking. In Auburn, as she told me this part, her eyes took on that faraway shine. "I didn't feel brave," she admitted. "I felt accompanied." By sundown, she was crouched in a lane behind the Baltimore market, hands shaking so hard she could barely hold still. A man in a flat cap passed by and didn't see her. A dog nosed the alley mouth and turned away. The auctioneer's laugh carried like a slap across water. Then, chaos. A shout, a woman's cry. Harriet moved. She slipped inside the press of bodies, smaller than most and quicker than anyone was watching for. Her hand found Kiz's wrist. Their eyes met, just a flicker. And Kiz did the bravest thing a mother can do. She didn't scream. Harriet stuffed the sailor's jacket into the hands of the older child, scooped the younger one into her arms, and pivoted through the crowd like she was nothing but air. "Hey!" a man yelled, pointing. Heads turned. A sheriff's badge flashed in the sun. Harriet ran. She cleared the alley mouth in 3 steps. The child clamped to her chest. Kiz pressed to her side. Boots thundered behind them. A shot cracked and shattered brick near her shoulder. Another. She didn't dare look back. The dock was ahead 50 yards, then 20, then 10. The boat's rope creaked, the captain's face unreadable. "Now," he said. Harriet leapt, and the world tilted beneath her. Her feet hit the wooden deck, the boards slick with river spray. The child whimpered once, muffled against her shoulder. Kiz scrambled aboard right after her, dragging the older boy, the sailor's jacket hanging lopsided on his small frame. The captain didn't wait for a single word. He yanked the rope free and the boat drifted from the dock with a groan of timber. Behind them, shouts multiplied. Boots pounded, a musket fired. The shot fell short, sending a puff of water into the air like a warning. Harriet kept her eyes on the opposite shore. She didn't breathe until the dock was nothing more than a smudge in the distance. The captain was a silent man. His face stayed fixed on the river ahead, his hands steady at the tiller. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask theirs. That was safer for everyone. The only sound was the slap of water against the hull and the children's trembling breaths. Kiz reached for Harriet's hand, squeezing it hard enough to hurt. "How?" she whispered. Harriet's gaze swept the silver-black water. "God gave me the road," she said simply. "All I had to do was walk it." That night, they hid in a barn 20 miles north, straw prickling their skin, the air thick with the scent of hay and horse. Harriet lay awake listening to the children's uneven breathing. She thought of the vision that had come before she left Philadelphia, the one she had tried to explain to Still. In it, she'd seen herself crossing a river in darkness, a small child in her arms, another clinging to her skirt. She hadn't understood the faces until now. She prayed quietly, thanking God for the strength in her legs, for the captain's silent hands, for Kiz's courage. But the prayer ended differently than she expected. "Lord, if you bring me safe this time, I'll go again and again until you tell me to stop." The journey north was a map written in whispers. Safe houses lit by a single candle in the front window. Barn lofts where strangers left bread and water before dawn. Hollow logs marked with a strip of cloth to signal the path was clear. Harriet learned every detail. the feel of the ground beneath her boots, the smell of each road, the sound of each creek, so that when she returned, she could lead others without hesitation. They crossed into Pennsylvania under a sky full of cold stars. When Kiz's feet touched free soil, she collapsed to her knees, clutching her children. The older boy reached up to touch Harriet's face, as if to make sure she was real. Back in Philadelphia, the Vigilance Committee was waiting. William Still wrote their names in his careful book, recording ages, family ties, plantation origins. Harriet stood by the table, hands folded, eyes lowered. She never liked being in the record. The less people knew of her movements, the better. Still handed her a small envelope, payment collected from abolitionist donors for her services. It was more money than she'd held in her life. "You could keep this," he said. "Settle yourself somewhere safe." Harriet tucked the envelope into her satchel without counting it. "Safe is not where I belong," she replied. Her second trip south began only weeks later. This time she guided a small group, 3 men, a young woman, and a baby, through thickets, swamps, and icy streams. She moved them at night, hid them by day, praying constantly for guidance. The dangers multiplied. Slave catchers roamed even the free states now, emboldened by the Fugitive Slave Act's passage. There were bounties on heads, hers included. She carried a small pistol, not for fighting patrols, but for a darker possibility. "If anyone turns back," she told her group, "we all die. Freedom or nothing." She hated the weight of that threat, but she knew the truth. One voice raised in fear could doom them all. By her third trip, whispers of Moses began to drift ahead of her. Some said she could turn herself invisible. Others swore she spoke to God, and he told her where the patrols were. Harriet never confirmed or denied the tales. Let fear work on her enemies. It might buy her an extra heartbeat in the next chase. But with the growing name came growing cost. She couldn't keep working day jobs and vanish for weeks at a time without drawing suspicion. Money ran thin. Her health worsened, headaches that split her vision, sudden sleeps that dropped her in the middle of the path. She learned to trust her feet to keep moving even when her mind slipped away. And then came the winter of 1851, when the snow lay deep enough to swallow a man's boot, and she found herself with a group of fugitives huddled in an abandoned mill. They had no food left, no fire, and the nearest safe house was 15 miles away. The wind cut through the walls like knives. A man muttered that they should turn back, that at least they'd have a roof over their heads if they surrendered. Harriet rose slowly, pistol in hand, eyes blazing. "We are not going back," she said, her voice low and unshakable. "We are going through, and the Lord himself is going to carry us the rest of the way." The next morning, they stepped out into the wind and found fresh footprints in the snow leading from the mill to the east. Following them, they came to a cabin where a black farmer's wife ushered them in, fed them hot bread, and wrapped them in quilts. When Harriet asked how she knew they were coming, the woman only smiled and said, "Sometimes the Lord tells a body what they need to hear." It was moments like that, the invisible hand at the right hour, that kept Harriet's feet moving trip after trip. And yet, with every journey, she knew she was pressing her luck. By the end of 1853, her face was on wanted posters. The reward for her capture was more than some men made in 2 years. One night, while crossing into Maryland again, Harriet saw one of those posters nailed to a tree. She stood there in the cold, looking at her own face drawn in ink, and whispered, "Lord, if you've got another plan for me, you best speak it quick." And the very next week, he did, though not in the way she expected. The air that night was heavy with the damp smell of marsh and pine. Harriet moved like a shadow among shadows, the group trailing behind her in single file. She had learned to listen with her skin, how the night felt when it was empty, and how it shifted when danger was near. This group was small, just 4 people. 2 brothers in their 20s, a woman with a shawl pulled tight over her face, and a tall man who said little. They had met her at the appointed oak tree just past midnight, each one glancing over their shoulder like the ghosts of their masters still followed. From the first hour, something in the tall man's manner set Harriet's spirit uneasy. His eyes roamed too much. He asked questions no one should, about her name, about where she lived, about how many trips she'd made before. She answered in half-truths and prayed he wouldn't slow the others down. They crossed a shallow creek just before dawn, water freezing around their ankles. Harriet led them into a thicket and signaled for rest. The woman with the shawl curled on the ground and slept instantly. The brothers sat together, whispering. Harriet's head throbbed, her vision dimming at the edges, one of her spells coming on. She fought it, willing herself to stay upright. When she opened her eyes again, the tall man was gone. Her heart hammered. She rose without a word and slipped through the trees, listening for the crunch of snow. She found him less than 50 yards away, crouched low, speaking to someone across a fence, a white farmer with a lantern in his hand. The farmer's dog was already barking, its voice carrying too far into the night. She didn't think. She stepped forward, pistol drawn, her voice low but like iron. "You best come back with me right now." The farmer startled and stumbled back, the lantern swinging wildly. The tall man froze, his mouth half open. "What are you doing?" she demanded, every muscle locked. I was just... You were about to kill us all." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You turn back now, and the patrols will have our faces in an hour. You open your mouth to anyone, and the Lord himself will have to hold me back." He swallowed hard, eyes darting to the pistol. "I ain't saying nothing." "You better not," she said, voice almost a whisper. "Because if I hear one hound on our trail, you'll wish you'd kept your tongue." Back at the thicket, the woman stirred awake. The brothers looked from Harriet to the tall man, sensing the current between them. Harriet only said, "We're moving now." The next 12 hours were a blur of frozen fields, backwoods paths, and quick dives into ditches when voices or hoofbeats came too near. By nightfall, their boots were caked with ice. They reached the next safe house, an old Quaker couple who welcomed them into the barn and piled hay over their sleeping forms like a blanket. The tall man never spoke again on that trip. At the final stop in Pennsylvania, before they were sent deeper north, Harriet pulled him aside. "You had a choice," she said quietly. "You could have run for yourself, or you could have run with us. Remember what you chose." He nodded once, not meeting her eyes, and stepped into the wagon that would carry them away. She never saw him again. That trip cemented one of Harriet's unspoken rules. Trust the Lord, but also watch the people. She began to carry not just food and a pistol, but a dozen small tricks. A way to bind someone's boots so they couldn't run in the night, coded phrases that meant danger, hide, or split up. Every precaution was a step between life and the whipping post. By now, the Underground Railroad was no longer just a loose network of sympathetic farmers and secret sellers. It was a living, breathing thing, adapting to the tightening grip of the Fugitive Slave Act. New routes opened, old ones closed. Cities like Philadelphia, once a haven, became traps, crawling with slave catchers, ready to snatch people off the street. Harriet adjusted. She began leading groups all the way into Canada, where American law couldn't touch them. The journey was longer, harsher, and often broke people's will before the end. But she refused to let them turn back. "A live slave is better than a dead free man," one man once muttered in the snow. Harriet stopped in her tracks, fixed him with a gaze that cut through the dark, and said, "No, a free man is worth walking through death for." In the winter of 1854, a vision came to her that would change the scale of her work. She saw a cluster of cabins under moonlight, voices crying out, and herself standing at the edge of the woods with open arms. She didn't know the place, but she knew the feeling. God was telling her to prepare for a group larger than any she had led before. Weeks later, a messenger found her in St. Catherine's, Canada, where she was delivering a small group to safety. A family in Maryland, 2 parents, 5 children, had word that Moses was near. They wanted to come, and they were ready now. 7 people in one trip. It was madness. The larger the group, the harder to hide, the slower the travel, the greater the risk. One baby's cry at the wrong moment could end them all. Harriet closed her eyes, let the silence stretch, and then said, "Tell them to meet me at the marsh before the full moon. We'll walk." And so began the journey, that would nearly cost Harriet her life. One that would push her faith, her body, and her unshakable will to the edge. Because this time, the enemy wouldn't be just patrols and hounds. This time, a price had been set on her head so high that even friends could be tempted. The marsh was black glass under the full moon, its water glinting between frozen reeds. Harriet stood at the meeting point, breath rising in steady clouds, listening. Every sound mattered out here. The crunch of ice, the wing beat of a night heron, the distant bark of a hound. She heard them before she saw them. A rustle in the cattails, then the quiet shuffle of feet. The parents emerged first, their faces drawn and pale, clutching a bundle each. The children followed like shadows. 3 boys, 2 girls, the youngest no more than 3, her hair in tight braids. Harriet counted them quickly, eyes sharp. 7 in total. The oldest boy carried a sack that sagged heavily, cornmeal, maybe some salt meat. The father's boots were worn thin, and the mother's shawl looked as if it had been mended 100 times. "Are you ready to walk till your feet forget they ever stopped?" Harriet asked. The father hesitated, looking at the moon, then at his wife. "We're ready." The first 2 nights passed without incident. Harriet led them along narrow deer trails, across frozen creeks, through pine groves so dark the stars seemed to vanish overhead. By day they hid in barns, cellars, and once, an abandoned smokehouse, thick with the scent of hickory. She pushed them hard, knowing that once word spread of such a large escape, patrols would tighten the net. Every stop was shorter than they wanted. Freedom don't wait for tired feet, she'd remind them. On the 3rd night, they reached a small village near the Pennsylvania border. Harriet had arranged for a safe house, a cousin of a trusted conductor. But when they reached the small, whitewashed cabin, she noticed something wrong. No candle in the window. She froze. "Back," she whispered, gesturing them into the shadows. A door creaked open. A man stepped out, a stranger. His eyes scanned the road, then settled on the dark shape of the group. He smiled, slow and too easy. "You the one they call Moses?" Her stomach tightened. No one who was safe asked that question out loud. "I don't know what you mean," she replied evenly. "Oh, I think you do." He stepped closer, his boots loud on the frozen ground. "There's a fine price for you down south. Enough to set a man up for life. And here you come, walking right into my hands." The father moved forward, but Harriet's hand shot out. "Not yet," she murmured. Her eyes stayed locked on the stranger. "You could try to take me," she said, her voice low. "But you'd have to explain to the hounds why you're bleeding before you ever spend that bounty." Her pistol was already drawn, though she kept it low, angled toward the ground. The man's smile faltered. "You wouldn't." She stepped closer until the moon caught the steel. "If it's between you and these children, try me." For a moment, neither moved. Then the man spat to the side. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, turning away. But Harriet knew men like that. Trouble was all they understood. She watched him go, waited until his shape vanished, then led the group in the opposite direction, abandoning the planned stop entirely. They'd travel until sunrise. By dawn, their legs were trembling, their lips cracked. The youngest girl's bare toes peeked through worn shoes, purple from cold. Harriet's head pounded, another of her spells threatening, but she pushed it down. "Just 1 more mile," she promised them, though she wasn't sure herself. That mile brought them to the Susquehanna River, wide, black, and iced over in jagged sheets. The crossing was always dangerous, but in midwinter, it was a gamble between frostbite and drowning. The father stared at the water, his voice shaking. "We can't take the children across that." Harriet looked at him, calm and certain. "We can't not." She tested the ice with the butt of her pistol. It groaned but held. "Step where I step. Don't stop, no matter what you hear." Halfway across, the youngest boy slipped. A crack split the night like a gunshot. Ice gave way beneath him, plunging him waist-deep in water. His scream ripped through the air. Harriet dropped to her knees, grabbing his arm with both hands, hauling him up before the cold could swallow him. The others froze in terror. "Move!" she barked. "Now!" They stumbled forward, the ice groaning under their weight. But somehow, Miraculously, it held until they reached the far bank. Harriet dropped to her knees, holding the shivering boy to her chest, whispering thanks under her breath. That night, they found shelter in a hayloft, the wind howling outside like wolves. The children fell asleep instantly, curled together for warmth. The parents sat with Harriet, their faces pale in the moonlight. "You saved us twice tonight," the mother said quietly. Harriet shook her head. "The Lord saved you. I just walked the path He laid." But when she finally lay down, listening to the steady breathing of those 7 souls, she knew the truth. She had never felt the ice thinner beneath her feet than she had this night. And yet, she also knew she would do it again. The rescue of that family became one of the most whispered tales along the Underground Railroad. But for Harriet, it was not her most dangerous journey. That was still to come, when the war itself would pull her into a new kind of mission, and her role as Moses would take on an entirely different meaning. By the spring of 1861, the air in the North was thick with talk of war. The first shots had been fired at Fort Sumter, and the lines between slave states and free states hardened into something sharper, something that would spill blood before it ended. Harriet was in St. Catharines, Ontario, when the news reached her. She had been there for months, recovering from her last journey. Her head still ached from the winter crossing, and her body bore the weight of more than a dozen trips south. She could have stayed there, safe in a country beyond the reach of American law. But safety was never her calling. When Union officers began looking for scouts and informants to work behind Confederate lines, Harriet's name rose quickly among abolitionist circles. No one knew the southern back roads like she did. No one understood the secret language of signs, safe houses, and whispered routes better. And no one could disappear in plain sight quite like the woman they still called Moses. Her first meeting with the Union brass was in a small parlor in Washington, D.C. The curtains were drawn, the air heavy with the scent of pipe smoke. A colonel with a stiff jaw leaned forward. "Mrs. Tubman," he said, "you have something our officers don't. Trust among the colored population in the South. We need maps, intelligence, troop movements. We need someone who can move unseen." Harriet's eyes met his without wavering. "If I do this," she said, "it's not just for the Union. It's for every man, woman, and child still in chains. You understand me?" The colonel nodded slowly. "We understand." Her first mission was reconnaissance along the South Carolina coast. She was to travel with a small band of scouts, men who could blend into the enslaved communities and gather information from behind Confederate lines. Harriet wore plain work clothes, her head wrapped in a faded kerchief, her posture bent like any field hand. What the soldiers didn't see, what the Confederates didn't suspect, was that she could walk into a riverside plantation, trade a few quiet words with a cook or a ferryman, and walk out with the exact number of troops stationed there, their patrol schedule, and the state of their supplies. But with new work came new dangers. In the North, her face had been known to friends. In the South, during the war, her face could be her death warrant. One night, moving along the Combahee River with 2 scouts, Harriet caught the faint sound of oars in the dark. She pressed her hand to the nearest man's arm, signaling silence. The river lay black and still except for a faint ripple ahead. Then, a voice, low, sharp, and wrong, "Confederate." They had been expected. Harriet's mind raced. Somewhere, someone had betrayed their route. She slid silently into the reeds, motioning the others to follow. They lay half submerged, the cold biting through their clothes, as the Confederate boat passed within yards. Lantern light flickered over the water, searching. A beam lingered on the reeds. Harriet did not move, not a muscle. The boat drifted past. She waited until the sound of oars faded into nothing before speaking. "We don't go back to camp tonight," she whispered. "We go forward. Whoever's talking to them might be waiting for us there." For the next 2 nights, they moved deeper into enemy territory, sleeping in pine thickets and abandoned cabins, surviving on cornbread and river water. Each day brought new intelligence: Confederate troop positions, hidden mines along riverbanks, and the names of plantations storing large quantities of rice and cotton for the Southern Army. By the time they returned to Union lines, Harriet had not only delivered her report, but had begun planning something far bigger, a coordinated raid that could cripple Confederate supplies and free hundreds of enslaved people in one sweep. It was an audacious idea, too audacious for most. But the commander she pitched it to listened carefully. "You're talking about taking Union gunboats up the Combahee," he said, "right into Confederate territory." "Yes," Harriet replied, "right where they won't expect a woman to lead them." The months ahead would test her like never before. For the first time, she wouldn't just be guiding a few souls under moonlight. She'd be commanding armed men on the water, with the fate of hundreds hanging in the balance. And if the raid failed, she knew what the Confederates would do to a woman like her. The night of June 1st, 1863, smelled of salt marsh and gunpowder. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, the Combahee River lying dark and wide before them. 3 Union gunboats, Harriet A. Weed, John Adams, and Sentinel, waited in the current, their hulls rocking gently. On the deck of the John Adams, Harriet stood small against the black sky, her frame wrapped in a dark shawl. Around her, the men moved quietly, loading rifles, checking lines. Some glanced at her with skepticism. It wasn't every day a woman led an armed military operation, much less a black woman, and certainly not one who had been born enslaved. But the officers knew something the skeptics didn't. Every turn in the river, every patch of reeds, every sandbar the Confederates had mined, Harriet knew from memory. She had spent weeks gathering intelligence from local people, enslaved men and women who risked everything to whisper the locations of traps and supply caches. And she had promised them something in return, not just safety, but freedom. She knelt beside the captain, pointing to the map spread on a crate. "Here's where the torpedoes, water mines, are set," she said, tapping a bend in the river. "We hug the west bank here, avoid this shoal, and move quick past the old rice mill. Patrols keep to the east side at night." The captain nodded, impressed. "You sure they won't see us coming?" Harriet's eyes flicked to the dark shoreline. "They might, but by the time they do, we'll already be taking their people home." They pushed off under cover of darkness, the gunboats gliding upriver like shadows. The air was thick with insect hum, every splash of the paddles sounding too loud. Harriet's gaze swept the shore, alert for the faintest movement. She knew the Confederates might have scouts hidden along the banks, or worse, informants among the enslaved who feared what the raiders might bring down on their families. At the first plantation, Harriet signaled with a lantern. 3 short flashes, the prearranged code. From the shadows, figures emerged. Women clutching children, men carrying sacks slung over their shoulders, the elderly leaning on sticks. Harriet called to them softly, come on, it's time." Some hesitated, eyes wide with disbelief. To them, freedom was a dream too dangerous to trust. Harriet stepped ashore, her voice steady but urgent. "I know you're scared. I was too. But God sent us for you tonight. Don't let him find you still in chains come morning." One by one they came. By the time they pulled away from the first landing, the deck was crowded with over 100 souls. The next 2 plantations were harder. At one, Confederate pickets fired from the tree line. The Union soldiers returned fire, while Harriet guided the people aboard, shielding children with her own body. At another, a bridge had been rigged to blow, intended to stop Union boats from advancing. Harriet had learned of it days before, and led the John Adams through a narrow side channel, bypassing the trap entirely. By dawn, the sun rose over a scene no one on that river would forget. 3 Union gunboats, heavy with more than 700 newly freed men, women, and children. Their voices rising in hymns that carried over the water like a victory drum. For Harriet, it was not just a military triumph. It was the largest single liberation she had ever been part of, a moment where her work as Moses and her work for the Union became one. When they reached Beaufort, South Carolina, the freed people were met with food, blankets, and medical care from Union camps. Some enlisted in the Union Army on the spot. Others began new lives in the coastal towns. A Union officer later wrote that Harriet conducted the whole affair with the utmost skill, leaving nothing for subordinates to guess at. But Harriet's own account was simpler. It wasn't me. It was the Lord. I always said, I trust to Him. I don't look to see if it's dangerous. I just go. Yet even as she celebrated, Harriet knew her work was far from over. The war was still raging. There were still people in bondage who hadn't heard the gunboat's hymns on the Combahee. And for the first time, she began to think of what freedom would mean in peacetime, for her people and for herself. But peace, when it came, would carry its own tests. Tests that would strike closer to her own home than any plantation or battlefield. The war ended with the crack of gunfire at Appomattox in April 1865. But for Harriet, the silence that followed was far more dangerous. She had walked through battlefields, faced down Confederate patrols, freed hundreds, but peace did not come with a pension, nor with the comfort she had earned. She returned to Auburn, New York, to the small brick home she had purchased before the war, a home that had always been a revolving door for anyone who needed it. Freedmen arriving from the South, the sick, the elderly, the orphaned. Harriet could never bring herself to turn anyone away. And so her home filled quickly, the beds taken by people who had nothing but the clothes on their backs. The food she had stored for herself was gone within weeks. The meager money she had saved from her work with the Union Army vanished into medicine, blankets, and shoes for others. What the government owed her for her service, the months as a spy and scout, the Combahee River Raid, the intelligence she had risked her life to gather, was tied up in endless bureaucracy. Some officers submitted paperwork for her. Others shrugged, claiming there was no precedent for paying a woman, let alone a black woman, for military service. More than once, Harriet traveled to Washington to plead her case. She walked the marble corridors of government buildings, her worn shoes whispering over polished floors, and spoke to clerks who could not, or would not, understand what she had given for the Union's cause. I served, she told one skeptical official. I fought without a rifle, but I fought. My pay was freedom for my people, but a soldier still needs to eat. He told her the claim was under review. It would remain under review for years. There were other wounds too, wounds no pension could heal. Friends she had trusted in the abolitionist movement drifted away after the war, absorbed in their own lives. Some people she had rescued now lived in the North but never visited, never wrote. Harriet never blamed them. Freedom was a gift they were learning to hold, but the loneliness still cut deep. And then came the betrayal that stung most. A man who had been helping her manage a small financial matter, someone she believed a friend, took advantage of her trust. One signature on a paper she barely understood, and she was swindled out of property she had counted on for security. I could stare down a gun, she told a neighbor bitterly, but I didn't know how to stare down a pen. Still, Harriet refused to close her door. She started taking in boarders when she could, cooking and cleaning to earn a few dollars. She sold pies in the market. She borrowed small sums from friends, always trying to pay them back. It was during these years that she met a young woman named Sarah Bradford, who would become her first biographer. Bradford, moved by Harriet's struggles, decided to write scenes in the life of Harriet Tubman to raise money for her. The book sold well enough to provide Harriet with a small cushion, though never enough to lift her from the edge of poverty. Harriet was grateful, but she also bristled at the idea that her life could be reduced to a few pages. They can't write the fear, she told Sarah one evening. They can't write the way the Lord's voice comes to you in the dark and says, "Step there." By the 1870s, Harriet began to turn her Auburn home into something more permanent, a place for the elderly and destitute to find shelter, especially those who had once been enslaved. She called it the Harriet Tubman Home for the aged. At first, it was just a few spare rooms and a shared kitchen, but over the years, with donations and the help of the AME Zion Church, it grew into a refuge that would outlive her. It was hard, unglamorous work, washing clothes, tending to the sick, finding wood for the stove, but Harriet believed it was her calling. I can't carry them through the woods no more, she said, but I can carry them to the table and see they have a bed. And yet, in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake in her own small room, she would sometimes think of the river crossings, the moonlit trails, the feel of the North Star on her face. The missions had nearly killed her, but they had also given her purpose, as clear as a bell in the dark. Peace was supposed to feel like safety. For Harriet, it felt like a waiting room, one where she was still listening for the next call. That call was coming, but it would not be to rescue strangers. This time, it would be to face the one journey she could not walk back from. By the 1890s, Harriet's hair had gone silver, and the limp from her old head injury had deepened. The years had not been kind to her body. Headaches still flared like lightning. Joints ached from the winters she'd spent sleeping on the ground, and her eyesight dimmed under the strain of age. Yet her presence could still a room. When she entered a church meeting or a veterans gathering, the quiet fell not from politeness, but from the sense that here was a woman who had walked with God in the wilderness. Recognition came late. In 1897, after decades of petitions, the U.S. government finally granted Harriet a pension, not for her service as a scout and spy, but as the widow of Union veteran Nelson Davis, whom she had married years after the war. It was an injustice wrapped in a small mercy, $20 a month, enough to keep her from absolute destitution. Friends from the abolitionist days, now older themselves, began visiting her in Auburn. Some brought food, others wood for the stove. Former Union soldiers tipped their hats and called her General Tubman, a title she had never claimed but never denied. And in 1896, she stood before a crowd in Boston to speak at the first meeting of the National Association of Colored Women. Her voice was slower now, but still carried the same quiet fire. "I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad," she told them. "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The applause rolled over her like a warm tide. In her final years, Harriet poured her energy into completing the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, working with the AME Zion Church to secure its future. She wanted to be sure that long after she was gone, those without family or means would have a bed, a meal, and dignity in their last days. But her own health was failing. The pain in her head grew unbearable, and she finally underwent brain surgery at Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital. She refused anesthesia, choosing instead to bite down on a bullet, the same way soldiers did on the battlefield, while the surgeon worked. "I've been in pain so long," she said afterward, "I didn't mind it." Even as her body weakened, Harriet's mind remained sharp. On summer evenings, she would sit on the porch with a quilt over her knees, telling stories to neighborhood children, of starry nights on the trail, of the moment she first stepped on free soil, of the hymns that had carried her people forward. She always ended with the same reminder: God's time is always near. You just have to walk till you get there. By 1913, she knew her time was short. She moved into the home she had built for others, now as a resident herself. The women she had once cared for now cared for her, bringing soup to her bedside, reading to her from the Bible. One March afternoon, with the first hint of spring in the air, Harriet gathered the women close. Her voice was faint, but her eyes were clear. "I go to prepare a place for you," she whispered, echoing the words of Scripture. "And when you get there, you'll find me waiting." That night, Harriet Tubman passed quietly into the arms of the God she had trusted with every step of her life. She was buried with full military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. The sound of "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" rising over the crowd. In the years that followed, statues were raised, books were written, and her name was taught in schools. But those who knew her best would tell you her true monument was not made of bronze or stone. It was the lives she had touched, the hundreds she had led to freedom, the sick and the poor she had fed, the courage she had lit in hearts that thought themselves too small to stand. She had been called many things in her life: Minty, Moses, General Tubman. But perhaps the truest was the simplest: servant of God. They say courage is walking into the unknown without proof of what waits ahead. If that's true, then Harriet Tubman spent her life walking into darkness with nothing but God's hand to guide her. From the cold marshes of Maryland to the battle-swept rivers of South Carolina, she stepped where others would not. She trusted when others froze. She risked her life not once, but over and over, until her very name became a lantern for those lost in the night. But here's the truth Harriet would want you to know. She was afraid too. She was tired too. She doubted too. The difference was that she never let fear take the lead. She let faith take it instead. It's easy to remember Harriet Tubman as a hero carved in stone, unshakable, unstoppable. But her story is more than the record of what she did. It's the question her life still asks us. When the path God sets before you is dangerous, do you trust Him enough to walk it? She didn't rescue over 70 souls because she was fearless. She did it because she believed that each life had value, and that the God who freed her demanded she help free others. In the end, Harriet's legacy isn't just the miles she walked, the rivers she crossed, the lives she saved. It's the reminder that deliverance often comes through ordinary hands. Hands blistered from rope, hands that still tremble in the cold, hands that carry others even when they're tired themselves. Maybe that's the real lesson, that the same God who lit Harriet's path still lights ours today. The question is whether we'll follow the light, even when the way ahead is dark. So tonight, as the fire burns low, remember her not just as Moses, the conductor who never lost a passenger, but as a servant of God who trusted Him in every storm. And ask yourself, if the knock came at your door tonight, would you answer it? Thank you for sitting by the fire with us tonight, for keeping her memory alive in the circle of our little gathering. Harriet's story belongs to all who believe that courage and faith can walk hand in hand. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.